Hi, I'm Gleb Bakhmutov, and welcome to my presentation, The Debate Between the Cypress and the Playwright Test Runners. Thank you to the organizers of this conference for inviting me, and before I start, I would like to say that I'm a member of several climate organizations, and I urge you to fight the climate crisis with me. I had a long career where I went from C++ to C# to Node.js and JavaScript. You can find a lot of my open source projects on GitHub and my writing at my blog. Now, during the day, I work at Mercari US. Mercari US is an online marketplace, and at work, I run more than 700 end-to-end tasks every day. I made a couple presentations that explain how we do this. You can find the slide decks at this URL. In this presentation, I'm part of a debate, but I have to say that I do love Cypress. I found Cypress a year before I joined the company itself. I used it before I went on board, and I worked on projects such as component testing, API testing, CI integrations, parallelization, and so on. Even now, I don't work at Cypress anymore, but I use it every day. I answer questions, I teach people, and I post blog posts and short videos explaining how to do things in Cypress almost every day. You can find a couple of my courses at cypress.tips. In this particular talk, I want to say that I'm going against my own advice. I have a blog post about good documentation where I say that I strongly believe that the author of a tool should not compare themselves to another tool. It just usually is unfair. So when I do this presentation, I want to say that what I will say is not to make fun or diminish a particular tool. If you perceive something that I say as a criticism, I want to say that this is a criticism that I want to be constructive. And I want to admire some of the great features from both testing tools. Now, I usually leave comparisons between the tools to the users. And there are a lot of comparisons that people have written about Cypress and Playwright. This is just a sample. And I only took comparisons that directly compare the two tools and not several tools, let's say Cypress versus Cafe versus Playwright versus WebDriver. No, these are comparisons that only look at two tools, and most of the comparisons actually not that great. The only two comparisons I might recommend are these two. One is a book and one is a series of articles, and the series is still attending, so take a look at those. The majority of presentations of the tools suffer from several defects. Usually they list cons and pros, and if you really look at items in the list, some of them are weird, right? The testing tool is accessible or extensible through plugins. Well, to me, it's a good thing, right? That means you can actually add things to the testing tool without waiting for the testing tool offers to actually add it. So to me, this is actually a positive. But the majority of comparisons have to be taken with a grain of salt. They usually suffer from two shortcomings. One, they're out of date. If you look at any comparison older than maybe a month or 6 months, usually it's not accurate. And another thing, that many comparisons don't evaluate the same thing. They compare pineapples to orange soda, so to speak. For example, some comparisons can say Playwright has a built-in application starting configuration. So when you run the test, it will actually start your server for you. Cypress doesn't do that. I've actually written a tool that Cypress recommends for starting the server, and when it responds, then you run the test. Well, some comparisons note that, but they don't note the other way, right? Cypress, for example, can serve the static page for you so you can visit index.html directly without starting a static server. Well, Playwright doesn't have it. So usually find these points in comparisons where, yeah, it's not totally technically accurate, or it's actually confusing and doesn't compare the same thing accurately. But even then, usually when you look at the list of features, and some are marked as green, yellow, or red, a tool having a particular feature or not, ask yourself, is this comparison accurate? Is this feature really not there? Or whoever is writing the comparison didn't find it, or didn't even describe what is happening correctly. How important is that feature to our particular project? Think, Is this the core feature of a test runner, or can it be implemented by a plugin? So in Cypress, the philosophy was make a tool that includes all the basic that are necessary for testing modern websites, but leave the seams so that the functionality can be extended through JavaScript. And I think that principle kind of guided the development of Cypress through the years. You can think of this development almost as an axis. You can have third-party tools like Star Server and Test, right? That's fine. They're outside of the tool itself. You also have plugins, NPM modules that extend Cypress but are not part of official core. There are features that are experimental, right? And for example, the component testing that I started used to be just a plugin, and then it moved to experimental stage and then became part of a core. And it's nice, right? This progression allows you to evaluate the features before you actually add the complexity into the code. I'll give you an opposite example. Many years ago, Cypress Core had a command called scing, which supported accessing Angular components. Well, you can think of this as being a decision that was made in haste and probably would not have happened today, right? You don't want to make any specific adjustment for a particular framework because that's just not, a purpose of end-to-end testing tool. So this command was removed. If you look at Cypress documentation, there are a lot of plugins, and to me this is a good thing. That means the ecosystem is healthy. More than 145. I have presentations about my favorite plugins that I use every day. I even have a course that teaches you my 20 favorite plugins. But let's go back to the comparisons. If you look at all those list of features that one test runner has and now one doesn't and vice versa, all of them are missing the boat. The most important difference between the two test runners is where the test is running. So let's take a test and we'll just say console log something, hello world. You can write it in Playwright, and you can write the same test in Cypress, just console log. When you run Playwright, you will see the output right there in your terminal because Playwright runs the test in Node. If you run Cypress test, you will see the output hello world when you open DevTools console in your browser because the Cypress test runs right inside the browser in the same window where the application is. And Cypress moves the application into its own iframe, so it's isolated. You can draw an architectural diagram of Playwright as two separate processes. So the Node process runs the test, it opens the headless browser, and it controls the browser through Chrome debugger protocol. If you look at Cypress, again, you have a Node process as well. That's the Cypress that you open using npx cypress open, npx cypress run. It runs a node, but it just opens the browser and it loads the bundle with Cypress spec and the testing code right in the browser window itself. And then that code runs and controls the application iframe and all the elements directly. And sometimes if you want to access something outside the browser, like a file system, maybe run a task, maybe access a database, well, there are commands for that, like site_task, site_write_file. So those make calls through a WebSocket to that node process. Now, to me, running something in a browser has a huge advantage. You can access the browser APIs and your application code that is running right there in that window directly. So Cypress includes Synon library, so you can spy and stop calls that your application is making, or the browser is making, or the DOM is making. In this case, for example, I'm spying on window.postMessage method calls. And then I can grab that Synon spy and check how many times it was called, and it was called with right arguments. You can directly subscribe to window events, right, or any kind of events, and notice that the variable messages, right, it's an array, and every time we get a message in our testing code, we directly just push it into that array, and we can grab that array and confirm that at some point it will have length of 2, and the first message was 1. The test runs right there. It has direct access to the JavaScript and all the objects by reference, and you can share the code and the variables. What this means sometimes that you can bypass methods and browser APIs that are problematic. So in this to-do MVC example, if you click on copy to clipboard, it copies the to-dos from your application into the clipboard. Now that's great. Here's me clicking the button, and sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, it fails because the browser was not focused when I clicked on the button. And the browser prevents you from, kind of stealing the content of clipboard if there is no focus from JavaScript, right? So how do we get around it? Well, we can look at our application code and we can see that at the end it calls the browser API navigator.clipboard.write text method. So what can we do in our code? Well, we grab the clipboard object and we use synonStub method to stop the method that's problematic. So we no longer call the real native method. We can click on a button and confirm that that method was called. The command log on the left shows every command, and it shows, the synonStub and so on. So to me, the fast visual useful feedback while you're writing and debugging tests is the key to successful test writing. Here is me writing to do MVC test where, I visit the site, I find the input field, and then I type 1 and 2. Now, when I'm writing the test, I want to also see what's happening. Notice every time I save a test, it reruns it. It shows me every command. It shows me that the application is making network calls. When something goes wrong, like the wrong number of elements is found, well, I can see it right there. I can inspect the elements right there by hovering over them. And I can, hey, maybe reset the data by making an API call. On the other hand, when I write a Playwright test, well, it runs it headlessly and gives me an HTML document with every command, but I can't really see what's on the screen, right? And to be fair, Cypress has a headless run. You can run it on CI, but it still gives me a message plus a screenshot plus the video, and the screenshot really shows what's happening. Now, the great feature of Playwright is the trace. I can run Playwright with trace on, and that's just amazing. It gives you this HTML site, and you can click on each command, see how the download, see all the output from each command. So the big discussion for Playwright team and the users right now is that it needs a good end-to-end watching mode, so you can keep writing the test and see how it runs. Finally, the current answer is to use either VS Code extension or a third-party extension that wraps around Playwright. So you decide. A lot of people discuss, the syntax differences between the two test runners. On the left, I have the Playwright syntax, and on the right, I have Cypress syntax. They are very different. Playwright uses very imperative and promise-based syntax where you have variables, you save values, you get them. Cypress is very declarative. It doesn't store intermediate values and uses a reactive stream where you first run the commands and schedule and then execute them one by one. So to me, think about the flow of information, like grabbing a placeholder input or grabbing the items, goes to the left into a variable. And for Cypress, you just let the value kind of flow through commands and assertions to the next command. I call it the Tinder, swipe left, swipe right syntax. The swipe left, the data flows to a variable on your left. Swipe right, the data flows through the commands. Similar to how you can write a for each yourself using imperative style, or you can write, something that using functional commands like map each and so on. Think how the data flows, right? Do you get the text from the element to the left, or do you get the element and then you get the value into the callback on your right? This is where the people get upset, right? And they're upset with the syntax and they think that accessing the variable or data in this way is counterintuitive. And to me, this brings the question, what do you really want to do with that n, with that value? So maybe you want to sort, there should be 2 items. Well, just say should have length 2. You think that there should be an even number of items. Just write it. Maybe you think that the page should show the same number of items as the network call loads. Write it, as an assertion. Even better, the problem with syntax and counterintuitive data flow is because you don't control everything that the application is supposed to do. You don't control the number of values, so you have to look it up in a network call. You don't control how application renders, so you have to actually confirm it. If you, for example, can stop a network call using intercept command, then you control how many items you expect to see free. So then every assertion becomes really simple. Get to-dos should have length 3. The flow of unknown data is now simple, goes to the right, and there are no callbacks, and it's all kind of point-free functional programming. I have a couple of videos that explain this, how if you control the test data, if you know what to expect to find on a page, then the entire test collapses into simple and elegant code. And in fact, it can be improved even more. I have a little plugin called Cypress Aliases. Alias is what you use to get data from, from page or network calls. And you can now extend the same syntax that you use, for example, for waiting for network intercept or getting syn on stub to using assertions, where you can say just, get to-dos should have the same length as the alias n. Okay, so the syntax was born when you're trying to tell a QA human user how to test a site. You start with dear user, start with no to-dos, right? This is site request. Visit application page, get the input box and type 1, type 2. And there should be 2 to-dos. So the syntax really approximates how a human user named Cy would test the page. If the test read naturally, then it probably is a good test. And if something looks complicated, I must say, you probably are testing it in the wrong way. You have a couple of ways to find answers, either at Cypress documentation site or at my examples. Now let's go back to that clipboard, right? We stopped the navigator method, but there is a better way. You can install a plugin called Cypress Real Events, and then it gives you a command like hover or real click. Now those commands are native and no longer use JavaScript. Instead, they will run and they'll succeed because they use a Chrome debugger protocol. So one of the big secrets in Cypress is that it uses Chrome debugger protocol 2 to perform some really privileged operations like visiting initial page, setting a cookie, and so on. It's not really documented, but it's available. That's what plugins can use today, and your code can use today. It's called Cypress Automation Remote Debugger Protocol. I even have a wrapper plugin called Cypress CDP that allows you to write commands that use anything from Chrome Debugger Protocol, if you can find it there. And the only thing missing really built in Cypress is listening to Chrome Debugger Protocol events. Unfortunately, that is not there, but it should be added. Now, if you look at Chrome DevTools protocol, you can find interesting things like tracing. Turns out there dev protocol command called tracing start. And if you search, I don't know, Microsoft Playwright repo, you can see that this is how creating the trace was implemented. So you can probably implement it in Cypress today through a plugin. Now, it's hard to predict things, especially the future, but here are my predictions for the next year. A lot of test runners, and it's not just Playwright and Cypress, but other things like WebDriver are now merging. Cypress will use more of Chrome Debugger Protocol, WebDriver based tools will use bidirectional protocol. So test runners are borrowing from each other. What I envision from Playwright team is writing a better end-to-end watch mode. I think this is a must. They now have a component testing in prototype. I understand it's a difficult implementation if you are Node and you want to run something in the browser, but it's possible, so I wish them luck. And I do want to see something that allows you to spy and stop browser API methods or application JavaScript methods, because right now it's difficult. From Cypress team, I want to see Chrome Debugger Protocol methods that I've shown moved into the core. Then you'll have native events like hover and so on. This has to be a core feature, I believe. I also want to see saving traces so that someone can inspect really what's going on better. And finally, from any team or from third-party tool, I want to see a tool that compares traces better automatically. Imagine seeing a trace for successful test automatically compared with a trace from a failed test and telling you immediately this is where things diverged. I think that would be a very good tool. And it's not about tool X versus tool Y. It's about tools looking at each other's implementation and looking at what users expect and want and saying, let's borrow from each other, let's learn from each other. And this actually happened. Cypress recently released WebKit experimental support, and WebKit is a browser behind Safari. And what we've done, they took work, open source work, by Playwright team that actually provides Playwright WebKit browser, and Cypress can now use it. So thank you to both teams for making this possible. Remember, it's not about dividing the pie. Some tools grabbed a piece of a pie, Cypress grabbed another piece of a pie. The biggest pie is uneaten. Applications that have technical debt, features that are not tested. Let's concentrate on every developer and every QA engineer being able to write end-to-end tests easily so that our websites all work. So how do you pick a testing tool? At the end of the day, you have to study a lot of them, and then pick the one that solves your current problem. Thank you. I'm Gleb Bakhmutov. You can find me online at my website. The slides are available. I'll be happy to answer all of your questions.